Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to go over some more stuff with CSS, and I'll also quickly review using Code Sandbox. So hopefully most of you guys have set up your project on Code Sandbox at this point. And again, sorry, we have to kind of switch over to a new platform. But I'm just going to review creating the project on Code Sandbox. It'll be a good chance to kind of review what we've covered already and then also just see it in our new platform. So I'll start with that. If you've already got things set up and you feel pretty comfortable, you might want to skip ahead to the next part of the video. I'm also going to go over some basic CSS stuff for layout, and then I'm going to go over a little bit more of an advanced layout at the end of the video. So that's our demo video for this week. I'll also create a video where I just quickly go over submitting the project for this week. So this is the last week for our website project, and so it'll be due next week. Yeah, that'll be the second video for that for this week. So anyway, let's get started. I'm gonna just go over to Code Sandbox, and I'm gonna just set up a new version of our project. So we have the CSS Basics project here, and I'm going to open this as a reference, but I'm going to create a new version of this project just starting from scratch. Since we're on this new platform, we didn't really get to see how this would look starting from the beginning. So again, you might want to skip this part and move ahead to when I start talking about CSS layout. But let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to create a new sandbox. And I'm going to start with HTML, CSS. And for this one, even though we're starting with a little bit of a review, I'm going to call this CSS Layout because that's the main thing that we're going to be covering. I'm going to put this in my root folder, and I'm going to make it public so you guys will be able to see the code. And I'll also try to go over a couple little things that I've noticed with some people, some issues with this editor that I've noticed people having. So anyway, I'm going to click Create Sandbox here. And this is what we're going to get as the default. And, pretty much looks exactly like what we would expect. We have our file browser on the left. We have our text editor in the middle pane. And then we have our preview over on the right. After we get through the basic setup, I'm going to open this preview in another window. And we're going to look at some more advanced tools that we can use. Some developer tools, so we'll do that in a minute. And when you start a new sandbox with the HTML and CSS, this is what you're going to get as a default. You're going to get a default index.html, which already has some stuff filled in. A lot of this stuff you can just leave there. It's pretty useful. One thing that you'll notice is that in their default, they use styles with an S at the end. I tend to use style, just singular. Either one is fine. It doesn't really make a difference. So you can just use that default styles.css. You can see they have a style in there that they use just as an example. So you can leave those or you can take them out. I'm going to go over setting this up from scratch again. But there's a couple of useful things in here, like this meta char set. This makes the browser run a little bit faster because it just tells it which characters to load. This tells the page to kind of like render at a 1-to-1 scale if it's on your phone. So sometimes the way that the web is set up, a website will actually like shrink itself to fit the whole thing into your phone browser. But in modern responsive websites, we don't really use that. So that's another thing that's useful to keep in there. This is to create compatibility across different platforms. So there's a bunch of stuff in here that they put in that's kind of default that's useful. And then in the style page, this is just a random style they're just using as an example. So we're just going to delete that. There's also this package.json file in here. This just kind of saves some basic things that the Code Sandbox wants to know about for how to set up the project. Don't worry about this, just ignore this. I tried deleting it when I was working on something and it came back, so don't bother deleting it either. But let's go ahead and set up our project. So I'm just going to delete everything in index.html and everything in style.css, and we'll get started again from scratch. So I have my CSS Basics project over here, which I'm going to use as an example. And I'm going to point out a couple things that are a little bit different in this editor as we go through. So let's just get started. Again, if you feel comfortable with everything that is set up already, just skip this part. So I'm going to start, of course, by adding my doc type. One of the nice things, of course, is that there's a lot of code hinting. So when you see, when I type in that first bracket, basically Code Sandbox is looking at that and saying, okay, this is the very beginning of the document, so they're probably going to do setting. They're probably going to set the doc type here. And so to accept these suggestions, you can just hit enter and it's going to fill in that whole thing for you. So that's great. This makes things a lot faster instead of having to go through and type out every single one of these characters and get typos and make mistakes, all of these other things that you might do. You can just accept those suggestions. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. If you like typing, go ahead and type, but the suggestions are good as well. The next thing that we're going to do, and here you see it doesn't actually have a suggestion. So sometimes it doesn't always know exactly what we want. But if we type in the first two characters, or maybe even, no, we need the first two characters here, it's going to guess again. And if we hit enter, I hit the wrong key there. If I hit enter, it's going to finish that for me. One thing that you probably noticed in the default template is that you are supposed to have a language attribute in your first HTML tag. And there's different tags for this, like English is EN, Spanish is ES for Espanol. So there's different languages. It kind of helps the browser and search engines like Google know more about what to look for in the website. So you don't have to have it there. Your website will still work, but you are technically supposed to have that there. So then notice that it kind of moved us over a little bit right here. It moved us over 2 spaces. So again, we're inside the HTML and it's going to move us over. It has a little bit of what's called opinionated syntax highlighting and formatting. So it is actually formatting our project as we go, which is useful if you like the way that they do the formatting. There's probably some settings where you could change this, but we're just going to stick with the defaults. So in here, we might want to start our head section. Let's close our HTML section just so we don't forget to do that later. So if I close the HTML section, it's going to put that on the first line or first column. So that looks good. And then we're going to have a head section. And inside the head section, we'll have a title and we'll call this Choose Your Own Adventure. And we'll actually be able to see where this title shows up in the preview window in a second. And then we're going to have a style sheet. So we'll say link, href, and I like style.css. Feel free to use whichever you want here, but I'm just going to change the name of that when I get there. And the type is going to be text/CSS. It's kind of interesting when it has suggestions and when it doesn't. I don't use this editor that regularly, so I'm not that familiar. So I'm kind of getting used to it along with you guys. So we have the href, the type, and then we need the rel. Notice that when I hit enter, it fills in the attributes. So it adds the equal sign, it adds the quotation marks. So it just kind of makes it a little bit faster. And the rel is a style sheet. And if I want to add some of those meta properties like the char set, it's probably going to give me, it doesn't give me a suggestion here. So for the char set, you usually want to go with UTF-8 unless you need to support like more Unicode characters, which if you don't know what that means, then you probably don't. But that basically just means support for lots of different characters. UTF-8 actually has support for a lot of characters like Chinese characters and other languages and emojis, all of that stuff. So that's going to be fine for us. And then if we want to add in, forget what, let's look up the one that they had, say HTML meta sizing viewport. Okay, so this is actually a good one to have. So you can see that right here. So the viewport is the thing that I mentioned before that's just going to keep it from resizing the browser in different contexts. So this is a good one. I'm just going to copy this. You can also click the copy button there. And I'm going to throw this in here. Okay, so that's pretty much what you would need as your sort of like really basic head section. We did cover a couple extra things that we didn't have before. You know, that's fine. You don't need those things, but we've got them in there now. Okay, so then let's add our body section. So I'm going to open and close the body. And again, notice that the editor is formatting for us, so it's moving stuff around, it's doing all this stuff, and as long as we're not making typos, it's going to be able to do that pretty well. If you do have like a typo like that or something, or missing a bracket, you will notice that it's not formatted quite correctly. And remember, you can either try to play around and fix a typo, but also remember that you can always go over to the HTML validator. And if you have a typo, this is a good way to quickly find it. Just go to direct input and copy all of your HTML and paste it in there and click check, and it'll tell you if you're missing anything. And some of this stuff, so this is telling me I shouldn't have this trailing slash, and that's something actually that Code Sandbox added in, and that's an old standard that we don't use anymore, but it's not going to break the website, so it's complaining about that. But if you see these yellow things or green things, that's just telling you this is, you know, we do this differently now, but as long as it's not red, notice, you know, it says it has no effect. So as long as it's not red, it's not a big deal. But yeah, we don't actually use these trailing slashes anymore, but I think Code Sandbox adds them in when we format. Again, if that bothers you, I'm sure there's a setting for that. Let's see if we can find, let's go to user preferences and let's see, I'll type in trailing and let's see. I don't see anything. Okay, so I guess they don't have a setting for this. So let's just ignore this for now, but you know, other editors will leave that alone. Okay, so let's add our content. So we're gonna start with the body. We have our H1, which is our main header. Choose your own adventure. You obviously can replace this with the title of your project, whatever you want it to be. And here we have to refresh the page to actually start to see the content. And when I refresh the page, notice it does more formatting. So you might like that, you might not like that, but it can be useful. So let's see what we had. So we had a paragraph. So I'm just going to copy the content here. Then I'll go back and add this in. So our first paragraph is an introduction to the project. And I have an extra little line here, so let's move that over. And notice when I save, it actually formats this. So this line is too long for the editor, so it's actually formatting this by putting out a new line, which is fine. HTML ignores line breaks like that, so you can see even though there's a line break here, in the preview of our project, you don't see that line break. So that's our first paragraph, and then I had a second paragraph where I think I just said, choose wisely. So let's put that in there. And then I had two paragraphs with two different choices. So one was I want to be an animator. And I'm not doing all of the options here. Obviously, for you guys, you have to, you know, fill out at least 5 pages, and you can build more than that. But I'm just doing this as a demo. So I want to be an animator, or I want to be a, what was the other one I said? Designer. Okay. But there's a weird thing I've noticed when I go to the other tab. I come back. Maybe I did that. I think it added in a paragraph tag for me. Anyway, I want it to be a designer. So yeah, just watch out for little, you know, when it makes little changes, it may not always be the change that you want. Okay, so now we want to make these links. So I'm just gonna refresh on adding a hyperlink. So we just are gonna look for the text that we wanna link. It can be the whole paragraph, it can be 1 word, it can be 2 words. Anything that we want to be part of our link needs to go in between our 2 anchor tags. So we're going to put an anchor tag on one side here, and then another anchor tag closing on the other. So we'll do that with animator, And we'll do that with designer. And it's actually hinting for me to add it. If I just hit enter, it'll put that in. And then for both of these, we need a hypertext reference. And I haven't made this yet, but I'm gonna make a pages folder. So we're gonna go into our pages folder first, and then look for the animator.html page. So we'll review all of that in a second. So same thing over here. We're gonna go into pages first, and then go into designer.html. And just like I did last time, I'm gonna make copies of these so I don't have to retype everything to make those pages. So let's update our styles first. So I'm gonna go ahead and rename this style. I'm gonna right click on the file and go to rename, and I'm just gonna take off the S. It doesn't really matter that much, but that's just what I tend to do. So now that'll be connected to our index page. On style.css, let's go ahead and look at our styles over here. So we have a whole bunch of styles. I'm not gonna review all of this, but just remember that basically, and we're gonna add a lot more CSS today, so we'll have a chance to review it. But we have importing our font here. We have our first tag, which is the body tag here. And then we have our curly brackets, and then we have our rules, and we have everything in there. So let's just go ahead and copy all of this, including our notes. Copy, and I'm gonna paste this into our style sheet. And now when I refresh this page, now we see our styles there. So that looks good. And so now let's make our links. So I'm gonna add a new folder. I'm gonna call this pages. So to add the new folder, I just click on this third button in the Sandbox toolbar. And then once I have the pages selected, I click on this new page button. So make sure that you have the pages folder selected when you click on the new page. Otherwise, it'll just put it in the main folder. I'm gonna call this animator.html. And then I'm gonna do that again and call it designer.html. And again, I'm just doing an example. So I'm not filling out the whole story. I'm not making all the pages that are required. I'm just doing this as a sort of starting point. So let's copy all of our HTML from the index page. And I'm going to paste it in here, paste it in here. So that way I don't have to redo everything. I'm just going to change the main content. So I'm going to delete everything except for the header on both of these pages. So I'm just selecting all of these paragraphs and just up to this H1. And then I'm just gonna finish up our story here. So let's see, what did I say for animator.html? Okay, so I said you chose to be an animator and you win an Academy Award. Let's put that in there. And then for our designer, we decide to be a designer and we get eaten by a dragon. Okay, so both of our stories, one has kind of a good ending, one kind of has a not good ending, and then they both just go back to the index page. So remember, you can branch into more pages, you can have multiple options, you can kind of explore different ideas with your story. Okay, so we have our basics set up. And so now I want to transition into talking a little bit about the layout. And I'm also going to go over some more developer tools. So that's kind of it for our review. We're going to look at some developer tools, and then we're going to talk about how to add different layout options. Okay, so one thing I want to do first is, instead of using this preview window, one of the things that's nice about Code Sandbox is that the preview they give us is a lot more useful. So if you click on this little button in the very top right of our preview window with the two squares, that's going to open up our project in a new window. So that's really useful because we can use our developer tools and we can get a better sense of how this page is structured. And then we can close our preview window and just look at our code over here. And so when I'm working, that's actually how I tend to work more often, is I usually have my text editor and I have my preview window, and I kind of switch back and forth between them. So the first thing we're going to look at is the web inspector. And so all the browsers have some version of this built into it. Some of the browsers they're going to be harder to access. So for example, in Safari, you have to turn this option on. And so if you're using Safari, I would recommend switching over to Firefox or Chrome. Chrome is obviously what I'm using, so that's going to be the easiest way to kind of follow these steps. But Firefox has a very similar basic set of tools. There's a couple ways to find these tools. One is to go into View and go to Developer and go to Developer Tools. That's not the fastest way, but it's probably the most straightforward way. You can also right-click and just go to Inspect, and that will actually bring you to a specific element on the page. So for example, if I right-click on the link and click Inspect, it's going to bring me right to that link in my tool set. I can also click on this little drop down here, go to More Tools and go to Developer Tools, and that'll open that up as well. But the way that I actually do this in most cases when I'm actually working on a website is I hit on Mac, Command Option, or on Windows Control Option, and then I for Inspector. And that brings up the this inspector window. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on mine just to make it more visible in the video, but you don't have to do this, obviously. And the thing that's really nice about this is built into the browsers. It's not really for regular people to use, but it's for developers to use to look at how a website is built and to test different options. And pretty much every website, you can access this. So for example, if I go to, let's go to the BMCC website. This might not be the best option because it's a little slow, but let's see how it's running today. So yeah, it's kind of slow. Let's go to the New York Times website. That'll be a good option because there's a lot going on here. So notice if I right click on one of the headlines, I can click Inspect and it brings me to a very similar looking setup. Although it looks like they have some stuff written in to prevent me from, oh no, here we go. Okay, so you can see, I can inspect that paragraph. I think when I open this up, it changed the layout of the site. It's a very responsive site, so you can see the HTML underlying all of this stuff right here. So pretty much every website lets you do this. Here's the BMCC website. We can see an example of this as well. And there we go. If you want to, change the BMCC website, you can click on here. And we can go over here and click edit and type in blah, blah, blah. And there we go. We changed the BMCC website. Obviously, this doesn't actually literally change the BMCC website. If I refresh, it's just going to go back to what it said. But you can see what the structure of the site is. You can make changes to see how they'll look. And then if you want to, you can go back and put them in your original code. So anyway, let's take a look at this, and it's going to show us how the layout works in a little bit more detail. So notice when I hover over the body, you can see some highlighting. So the blue highlight represents like the main block of content. The orange highlight represents a margin. We don't see it yet, but there's a green highlighting that we'll see that we'll add in a second that adds padding. There's also this little iframe here that has this button to open this in the sandbox. We're just going to ignore that. We're going to ignore everything that the Code Sandbox kind of like adds into the website. We're just going to use the stuff that we added. So notice when I click on the body over here in this section, sometimes this is on the bottom. That's the CSS rules. Sometimes it's on the right, and sometimes it's on the bottom, depending on how big this window is. And so if you look over here, you can see this is the user agent style sheet. This is the built-in default styles for the browser. So you can see there's actually a couple default styles. One is that the margin is 8 pixels. You can see that's the orange area that's surrounding the entire body section. So that is that's the margin. And then the other default is that it's display block. And basically what that means is that it takes up the entire, whoops, I think I accidentally, oh, there we go. Let me open up my screen brush. Having a little trouble typing this morning. So when I say block, that just means that it takes up one whole block of the website. That's why you see there's some space here, even though there's no content here. basically each part of our HTML gets a block and then it moves down to the next block. So each one of these paragraphs gets a whole block, etc. That's sort of the default for most of our elements. You can see the body is one big block, the H1 is one big block, each paragraph has a big block. But we can turn that off or we can change that. Some elements do not have a default block style. For example, our anchor tag does not, because we want our anchor tag to be able to fit inside of the paragraph. So if we had anchor tag as a block style, if I said displays block here, it would move it onto its own block, and that doesn't really make sense for what we want to do. So that's the default for all of these. If I took a paragraph and I change the style to block. So another thing that's cool in our inspector is I can actually add rules here. So if I click on the plus, you can see I can add a p tag here, and I can say, what if we change the display to inline? Now all of our paragraphs are just right next to each other. So there's these default styles that are put in by the browser. You can see when we select our paragraph, it has a bunch of default styles, display block, and then it has a margin. And we can see that margin. There's an orange margin at the top and the bottom. The default is 1 which remember is our unit. That means basically one of the default font size. So that's basically what's happening with our defaults. There's some more defaults. If we click on the anchor tag, you can see it has a default color. There's the user agent style sheet, and it has this web link color. But we overwrote that in our own CSS. So you can see it also shows us our CSS, and it even shows us the line of CSS where this occurs. So it makes it really easy to look at the rules that are written and then go edit them if we want to. This brought us over to the sources tab. So if we want to go back, we just click on the elements tab. So the sources tab shows us the actual sources, which can be useful. And the element tab allows us to interact with them. And you can change the rules here, but again, you're not making a permanent change. So if I want to try what different font colors would look like for my header, I can try some different options. And then if I like this, I could copy this and bring it into my original design. So I could just click on that color and hit Command C. That's a hex value. Go to style.css, and then I could just replace this color here. So when I save that, now if I reload the page, you'll see that I actually implemented that color. But if I change the color and then just refresh the page, it's going to go away. So those changes don't affect our actual files. It's just a preview of what it's going to look like here. So let's go over a couple layout properties. I'm going to start with our H1, and then we'll also look at a couple more basic properties. So with the H1, you can notice a couple things right off the bat. There is, let me make this a little bigger. So we have these margins on the top and bottom. We can see those default styles down here. And then we have the blue content in the middle. So CSS uses something called the box model. And basically what the box model does, I'll draw a little diagram. You have your content, and this is your H1 or your paragraph, whatever the size of the content is, or images, whatever you're using. That's one section. You then have a margin, or sorry, actually, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. You then have what's called padding. We haven't seen this yet, but padding is kind of in between our content and the outside of the content. We then have a border. We'll add this in a second. And then outside of the border, we have the margin. And that's the space in between the inside of the content and the outside of the content. And so that lets us do some cool things with layout. So for example, with our H1, let's say we add in a border. I'm mainly doing this just to visualize. So if I type in border, you can see there's a lot of styles related to the border. So let's do a border color. There's a lot of styles here. So let's do a border color. Whoops. And we can use the same border, the same color as our text. So I'll copy that and say border color and paste that in. And so you don't see it yet because we also need a border width. And I'll say let's say if we do 1 pixel, it's probably going to be too thin. So let's do like maybe 6 pixels as an example. And then we need a border style. So to see this, we're going to do a solid border. Okay, so if we add these 3 rules, we see this border around this section. There's a lot of stuff that we can do here. This is actually giving us a hint, which is what I'm about to talk about. Let's make that go away. So you can see that we have this border. There's a lot of stuff we can do, like we can have a border just on the top, we can have a border just on the bottom. There's different things we can do here. But the other thing that we'll see with CSS, which that Chrome hint was telling me, is that you can actually combine these rules together. So a lot of times when you see CSS rules, you'll see that they actually take a bunch of rules and put them into one thing. So if I just say border and then I put my rules together, the thing that makes this tricky is you have to have them in the right order. So this is something that you just kind of have to get used to over time. So if I want a border, I'm going to have to say the width first. So I'll say 6 pixels and then the style, solid, and then the color, I'll paste that in. Okay, so now if I turn these off, now you can see we get the same border. And if I open this up, you can see that it's filled in these rules. So a lot of CSS rules look like this. It takes a little while to get used to it, but you'll see that if you look up examples. So now we can use this border to kind of visualize the rest of the box model a little bit. So if I put in some padding, padding is going to go in between the content in the border. So if I do 1 EM, notice that we now have this like green content or this green padding in between the content and the border itself. And then if I do margin and I do 1 EM here, now you can see we have the same amount of space, but now it's outside of the border. And so this is how we can kind of like make these different sections of our page. Notice that it doesn't affect any of the other components of our page. So we're going to look at ways to apply styles to the whole site in a more efficient way in just a minute. But for now, let's just cover these basics. So I'm going to get rid of this margin and just stick with the padding for now, just to give it a little space. That kind of looks nice. Notice that when I open up this padding, that it's actually applying padding to the top, right, bottom, and left. And so we can actually write our rules. Again, we can combine those rules. So if I just have one value here, it's applying that to all areas of the padding. But sometimes we might just want padding on the top and bottom. So we could say padding is 1 EM and then 0. And so what that does is it combines top and bottom first. So that gives us the green at the top and the green at the bottom. That's the 1 EM. And then for right and left, it stays 0. And you can see that, it starts with top and bottom and then it goes to right and left. And it's basically combining, if you're going to have a top property, you're more likely to have a bottom property. Same thing with right and left. But we can write all 4 in one line. So if I say 0, then 1 EM 0, that's going to give us the same effect. We go top, right, bottom, left. And it also goes clockwise. So that's another way to think about it, starting at the top and going around the clock face. Okay, so none of this is in our actual style sheet. This is just in the preview styles. So let's say we want to keep this. I'm going to copy this and go to the layout and find my H1 and then paste that in there. And then I don't really need to write out this whole thing. So I'm just going to write this a little bit. And I'm going to save that. And then I'll refresh this and oh, I didn't actually write my border rule. So let's do that. So I'll say border is, I'm going to make it a little smaller. 6 pixels was too big. So I'm going to say border is 4 pixels, solid. And then I'm going to copy this color from up here. And that's a hex color. So you need to make sure to have the little hashtag at the front. Okay. So now we have this set up. So now let's say, what if I wanted to add a margin to the entire website? So the body has this default margin, but let's say we wanted to add a margin and we wanted to kind of center our website. The other thing that we're going to see is as we get more advanced, and this is what we're going to start doing in the next couple parts of this lesson, as we start to get more advanced, we need to put parts of our page into other parts of our page. So this is called nesting. We kind of talked about this in a couple other examples. with our animation project and with our HTML. But basically, we have we have these sections here. But if we want to style, actually we don't have the iframe. If we want to style these sections together and add, a more margin or a border, padding, whatever, we need to put them all into a container section. And so sometimes people call this a wrapper container. I see both of those used a lot, but we're going to do that now. And that's going to change the way that we have to write our styles a little bit. So let's get started with that. So I'm going to go back to my index page, and this is going to be a good chance to look at a few different things that are very common in building a website. So I'm going to take all of this content and I'm going to put it inside of a big container. So that way I can style the container and it'll apply to everything that's in there. So I'm going to make a new line in my index, and I'm going to have to apply this to my other pages. So that's another thing, is that when you're creating HTML, a lot of the time you want to set up your basic layout first before you make your other pages, because otherwise you're going to have to go through and edit all the pages. But this is just kind of how the process tends to work. So I can use a div here. Div stands for division. It comes from magazines layouts, like you divide the layout into different sections. This is just sort of like a default name for any element that doesn't have a specific thing, but we're going to add styles to. So in a lot of web pages, you'll see tons and tons of divs that have layout components. So one thing that we're going to do that's a little different here is we're going to give this div an attribute, and that attribute is called ID. An ID is used if you have one element on the page that has its own specific styles. You can think of this as like your name or your CUNY ID. This is one thing that identifies one part of the page. So this is just a normal attribute. We're just going to give this a name. I'm going to call it container. Sometimes you see this called wrapper or wrap, but container is what we're going to use here. And then I'm going to go down to the bottom of this section that I want to be in the container, and I'm going to close this. And I think when I hit save, Code Sandbox is going to organize this for me. So it moves all of the content into this container, moves it over a little bit. And in Code Sandbox, like most code editors, there's these little arrows next to the numbers on the side where I can collapse or fold the sections of content. So if I have a really long page, I can fold the sections that I'm not editing and focus on the sections that I am. We don't have that long of a page, so we don't really need to do that right now. Okay, so now if I go back to my preview and I refresh this, notice now all of my content is in this container. And if I open that up, I can see the content, but now I can style the container. So if I go over here and I say margin is 1 EM, now look, it adds this margin, but it applies to both the header and my paragraphs. So that way I can style the whole section. And one thing that you see a lot in a website when you have a container is you'll see this rule a lot. I'm going to say margin, I'm going to say 0 for the top and the bottom, and then auto for the left and the right. And what that does is it calculates how much space is left. So this isn't going to do anything to start, but if I set a width, so if I say width for my whole element, and I'm going to choose something small just to make this very clear. So I'm going to say 400 pixels. So notice now my content is centered in the page. And if I change the size of the window, it's going to move into whatever the center is. So that auto rule here basically says it's going to take whatever space is left. So it's going to subtract 400 from the width of the page, and it's just going to apply that evenly to the left and the right. And so that's how we can get a very nicely centered website. More likely, this would probably be something like 600 pixels or 800 pixels, depending on how much content is on your website. But we can do something like that to get a nice center. So let's go over to our CSS and apply this. So I'm going to go to style.css. And so normally you can really put this wherever you want, but I might put this up here next to the body section. Or you could actually put it down here as well. You could decide where do I want to do my basic styles versus my layout. I think I'll do it down here. So I'll make a section for layout. And then I'll start. Notice it's actually suggesting to me here dot container. We're going to go over what that syntax means in a second, but this is not actually the syntax we want. So keep in mind, sometimes the editor is going to make suggestions that are not going to work for your particular example. So for ID, what we use is actually a hashtag. And notice again, it's making the suggestion hashtag wrapper. I mentioned that sometimes people call this a wrapper, but we called it a container. So when we put container in there, notice also it's making the suggestion of the rules that I just covered. So if you like its suggestion, you can hit, well, it went away, but I think you hit tab and it'll put it in there for you. But I recommend just, writing it out. So let's set our width to, and make sure to spell width correctly. Width is kind of a hard word to spell because it has the D and the TH in there. So for our width, we want 600 pixels. And then our editor is already suggesting that we add the 0 auto rule for the margin. So let's go ahead and hit tab and we can save that. And now we have our website is nice and centered. So that's looking pretty good. We are going to add one more layout component. There's obviously tons of different things you can do with a layout that we're not going to have a chance to cover. But one thing that often comes up is how can we put these two choices next to each other? There's actually a lot of different ways to do this. I'm going to cover one that is my preferred method, but there's not necessarily one way to do everything. But I'm going to go over a really simple way to do this, which is to add in a simple little grid. We can do this with some very basic CSS and a couple changes to our HTML and not too many extra rules. So let's look at how to do that. I'm going to go back to the index.html. So we're making sort of a little subsection within our main section. So we have these two choices, and if we want to line them up next to each other, there's different ways we can do it. We can do it without adding any HTML, but it's going to be kind of hard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a sort of sub-container that just has these two paragraphs in it. So our website structure is going to get a little bit more complicated, where we're going to have our container. So we have our container, and then we have our header and a couple paragraphs, but then we're going to have another div that's a separate container with our two choices inside our container. And that's how most HTML ends up getting kind of set up. So we're going to look at doing that now. So let's go back to our HTML, and now we're going to find this section with our two paragraphs, and we'll put a div that contains both of these paragraphs. So I'll add another div, and when we style a div, notice that we're just using the same name, div. This is just the generic term, so that's why we need to give them separate IDs. So I'm going to give this an ID, and I'm just going to call this choices. So this is the section that has our two choices for our story. So then I'll go after our two paragraphs and I'll add a closing div. And again, when I save, Command S or Control S, Code Sandbox is going to format that for us. So again, this doesn't do anything by default. We don't see any change yet, but what I can do is go in here. Now I have this choices section, which contains both my choices. And I could say something like this: display is grid. And then I can say grid, and then I can set the columns. So a grid is basically anything that's divided with columns and rows. I'm just going to have columns. So I'm going to do grid column. Actually, there's a special rule for this to set the columns. Excuse me, it's grid template columns. And here I can just set how big I want each column to be. So I can use whatever units I want. If I say I want each one to be 100 pixels and I put them next to each other, we're going to see we get our content next to each other. And I can do as many columns as I want, but I only have 2 paragraphs. So if I add more after this, we're not going to see those there. So 100 pixels is obviously too small. So I can also use percentages. So if I say 50% for the first column and 50% for the second column, I'm going to get a nice even layout. If you have 3 choices, you could use 33%, or there's other ways that you could set it up. But this, since I only have 2 choices, this gives me a nice grid with 2 options. Another thing that you can do that's a little bit more complicated, but will work for different types of units is you can use a fractional unit. So if I say 1FR, 1FR, it basically does the same thing as the 50%, but it's just dividing up the sections by how many units we have total. Another thing we can add is a gap. So if we don't want our sections to be right next to each other, I can say grid gap, and I could do 1EM, and that's going to add a nice little gap in between our two columns. So again, this is just in the preview. Let's go ahead and add this in our CSS. So I'm going to go to style.css. I'm going to add a new ID. So I just use the hashtag. I'm going to call this choices. And I'm going to set the display to grid. And I'm going to set the grid dash template columns to 50% each. And then I'm going to set our grid gap. So notice it's making a lot of the same suggestions that we might come up with on our own. But you don't necessarily want to take all of those suggestions. Okay, so now we've set our grid. And so now we can see we have our two options here. I didn't actually use our images here, but our image would also fit in here because we have the width is 100%. So if you had two different images inside of these sections, that it'll follow the same layout as long as they're inside the paragraph along with the rest of our text. So that's a little bit more of an advanced layout. Obviously, there's lots and lots of other things you can do with this. I can't go over every single thing, but this is a good thing to just get us started. Notice that our style doesn't work when we go to our other pages. So let's implement that real quick, and then that'll be it for this video. One other quick thing that I just noticed, you may also want to center some areas. So for example, with our H1, we've centered our website, but you might want to center this actual text. There's a rule for that, which is just text align, and we can set that to center. So you might like that, you might not. You don't need to use that, but that's just an option to be aware of. I think it looks pretty good there, so I'm just going to add it into my style sheet. Okay, so now let's finish adding our styles, and then we will wrap up. So I'm going to go to my animator.html page. The style sheet is not linked because, remember, we're in the pages section, and our style sheet is on our main folder. So we have to go back to the main folder. So to do that, I do ... and then slash. ... means go back, slash means folder. And so that's how we can get the style sheet. But then we're also going to have to update our HTML. So remember, we have this new container section. And so I'm going to add in a div ID equals container. And I'm going to wrap that around my content. I only have one option in this section, so I'm not going to use my choices grid, but I could add in the same content there if I wanted to. So now if we go to the animator page, we see the same style, but designer isn't set up yet. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go to designer.html and just make sure to have the ... slash in front of style.css. And then let's add the div container. So I'll say div ID equals container. And then I'm just going to make sure to close this at the bottom, and it gets formatted when I save. And so now we refresh that. And so now we have these two options. And of course, there's lots of other styles you could do to adjust this. If you have specific ideas for things that you want to do that we haven't covered, just send me an email, or we can go over it in office hours. You can also just try Googling it. There's you can find a lot of examples on Google or other places to help you kind of figure out the specific styles that you might want to add. But that's it for now. I'm going to make one more quick video where I go over submitting this project. But that's it for this demo, and I'll see you guys in the next video.